Good morning. I'd like to extend a special thank you to whoever it was that went to Southern California and brought the sunshine back with you. It is my pleasure to introduce our morning speaker, Dr. Michael Ward. We will have Dr. Ward here in chapel with us and then giving a lecture this afternoon at 4:15 in Mills 180 on Planet Narnia. Dr. Ward studied English at Oxford, theology at Cambridge, and his PhD from St. Andrews. He has served as the chaplain of St. Peter's College at the University of Oxford and was for a time the warden of the Kilns, the Oxford residence of C.S. Lewis. He is currently a senior research fellow at Blackfriars, Oxford. He is professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. He is a writer. He is a speaker. He is also a leading expert on the works of C.S. Lewis. And in 2008, Oxford University Press published his groundbreaking book, Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And all of those things are fantastic and wonderful, but his true claim to fame is that, forgive me if I take a small liberty here, he starred alongside Pierce Brosnan in the James Bond film, The World Is Not Enough. Please, a warm Scots welcome for Dr. Michael Ward.
Good morning. Yes, I have a British accent. Welcome back from spring break. Spring, the coming of new life. In a few weeks' time, we will be celebrating the Feast of the Resurrection. And I want to start my remarks this morning by reading to you one of my favorite passages from the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus on the road to Emmaus from the end of Luke's Gospel. On the first day of the week, two of the disciples of Jesus were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. That is to say, Jesus' recent death at the hands of the Romans and the disturbing report they'd received that very morning from some of the women in their company that his tomb was now empty. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation which you're holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the third day since this happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. And they came back, saying they had even seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He appeared to be going further, but they constrained him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them, and their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 gathered together and those who were with them, who said, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. We'll be coming back to that passage in a moment, but now let me tell you about something that you've already heard a snippet about, something that happened to me several years ago when the phone rang one day, and the voice at the other end said, "Do you want to be in a movie next week?" My name was on the books of an agency that provided extras to filmmakers whenever they came close to where I was living in Oxford. So this wasn't an entirely unexpected invitation. Every 6 months or so I'd get a call asking me to be in a film or a TV show or even a commercial sometimes. But on this occasion, the voice at the other end of the phone said, "You really want to be in this movie? It's the James Bond movie." So I went through the motions of consulting my diary and then said, "Yes, I think I'm free next week." So I show up at the film studios in West London, and it turns out, rather unusually, that there are only about 10 of us extras summoned for the day's shoot. And of the 10 of us, about 4 of us are called onto the set. It's a fantastic set, made to look like the interior of a Scottish castle, but it's really the lab where Q does all his experiments and creates all the gadgets that he gives to 007. The assistant director beckons me over and says, "Come and sit here and fiddle with this pair of X-ray spectacles," which they put into my hands. "And then James Bond will come over, he'll snatch them out of your grasp, and you must give him an angry look." Well, this is quite exciting, I think, because normally when you're an extra, you are in a big crowd scene. You never even get to see the actors, let alone interact with them. And here I am in a scene with James Bond. I wasn't expecting that when I woke up that morning. So I do as I'm told. I pretend to be fixing these X-ray specs. James Bond, Pierce Brosnan, comes over and takes them out of my hand. I give him the angry look, and that's it. Well, of course, it's not it, because we then have to do it 17 times, because they keep forgetting their lines, and the camera angles are wrong, and the light is wrong, and there are planes flying overhead, and so it takes all the morning. And at the coffee break, I go back to the green room, and I look at the other 9 extras, and trying to work out why I have been singled out for this particular role. And I look at the other 9 people, and I realize, after looking carefully at them, that I am the only one who is bald with glasses. They wanted this look. Apparently, I looked like a nerd. I looked like a computer boffin, I looked like a lab technician, and so I like to say that it's the only time in my life that I found a real benefit to losing my hair and going blind. But I mention this because the X-ray spectacles didn't actually work. When in the movie James Bond puts them on, they help him to see through clothing, to see if anybody's got a concealed weapon about their person. But when I put them on, between takes, they didn't work at all. It's all fiction, disappointingly. However, my own spectacles, these ones that make me look like a nerd, they actually do work. When I take them off, you all look suddenly very fuzzy. It matters what kind of lenses you look through. If you've got perfect eyesight, you're okay. You don't need any kinds of spectacles, X-ray or otherwise. But most of us don't get through the whole of our lives with perfect eyesight. We need a little help from time to time. And not just with our physical eyes, but with the eyes of our heart, the eyes of our soul. How can we see the truth of things? How can we really discern what's going on in this mysterious life that we live? And this is where we return to the Emmaus Road story from Luke's Gospel. Taken one way, the road to Emmaus story is one of the funniest things in the Gospels, I often think. It's a very Jewish kind of joke. It's a sort of setup. It's an anecdote. There are 2 foolish mourners meeting the Lord of all wisdom and life. So there you have a great incongruous encounter. Here are the 2 disciples reflecting very sadly, very soberly on Jesus' recent death and the report from the women that the tomb is empty. Lo and behold, Jesus himself comes up to them. You can almost hear the pantomime audience from behind roaring out, "He's behind you!" But do they recognize him? They do not. He asks them what they're talking about. Well, surely they'll recognize his voice. No. They simply stand still, looking glum. And then one of them, perhaps with a touch of petulance, says, "Are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have been going on here lately?" Picture Jesus' face. The straightest poker face in history. As he politely replies, "What things?" And then he has to listen while they tell him all that he's just accomplished by way of defeating death and saving the world. Not that they actually believe that that has happened. They've got quite a different perspective on it at the moment. But you can imagine him listening patiently as they go through this rigmarole and nodding sagely and throwing in the odd, yes, what did you say to him? And at the end of all this nonsense, after they've presumably added the rider, "Of course, we don't believe a word of it," you can imagine him rolling his eyes and looking at the audience, shaking his head wearily. The Socratic irony is very amusing. And then, as in all the best anecdotes, comes the unexpected ending. Jesus begins to show them how they've got it all wrong. Starting with Moses and all the prophets, he unfolds for them in the scriptures the things concerning himself. What sort of things might he have been talking about? Well, we'll come back to that in a minute, but first let me tell you another story about something that happened to me a few years ago. This one isn't true. One day, I took my car into the repair garage for its annual overhaul. At the end of the repair job, I collected the car, and as I was driving it out of the garage forecourt, I realized I'd forgotten to check on something, so I wound down the window, called over my shoulder to the car mechanic and said, "Are my rear indicator lights working?" To which the car mechanic replied, "Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes." My car mechanic was very stupid. He had sight, but he had no insight. A flashing light on the back of my car, as far as he was concerned, could have only one possible meaning: electrical failure, an insecure connection. He was able to see the raw data, the light on, the light off, the light on, but he was unable to discover the correct meaning of those brute facts. He focused on the externals, and he failed to perceive the inner significance. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus unfolds for the two disciples on the Emmaus Road the things in the scriptures concerning himself. They also had focused on the externals of the Hebrew scriptures. They hadn't perceived the inner significance. What sort of things in the Hebrew scriptures was Jesus talking about? Well, we don't know precisely, but we can make an educated guess at the sort of thing he said. He presumably mentioned, among other matters, the story of Jonah. Jonah in the whale, in the big fish. We know this from Matthew's gospel, when people come to Jesus in Matthew's gospel saying, "Give us a sign about who you are." He says, "I'll give you no sign except the sign of Jonah, for as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth 3 days and 3 nights." Perhaps Jesus mentioned Jacob's ladder. Again, from John's Gospel, we know that Jesus applied that Old Testament picture to himself. Jacob dreamed of a ladder stretching from earth to heaven and angels ascending and descending on it. Jesus says to Nicodemus that I am the true Jacob's ladder, so to speak. I am the true connection between earth and heaven. You will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Maybe Jesus mentioned the story of Job, the archetypal innocent sufferer who goes through all sorts of trials and tribulations, but does not curse God, remains faithful to God, and is, at the end of the story, restored. Perhaps Jesus mentioned David slaying Goliath, the young boy, the almost unarmed young boy who achieves the improbable victory over the well-armed Philistine giant. Perhaps Jesus mentions Samson bringing down the temple, Samson achieving more by way of defeating his enemies in his death than he accomplished in his life. These and many other things from the Hebrew Scriptures Jesus may have mentioned. Perhaps above all, he would have spoken about the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. I'm sure you've noticed how the story of Genesis foreshadows the story of Jesus in so many ways. Genesis chapters 37 to 50 are in many ways a kind of dry run for the Gospels, because Joseph, son of Jacob, is the beloved son, preeminent among his brothers. Jesus is the beloved Son of God the Father, with whom he is well pleased. Joseph is betrayed into slavery by his brothers. Jesus is betrayed by Judas and deserted by his friends. Joseph rises to prominence in Egypt and through his wisdom averts the effects of the famine. Jesus rises to life on the third day and through his power destroys the sting of death. Joseph's brothers intended to do him harm, but God intended it for good. Jesus' executioners intended to do him harm, but God intended it for good. What at first sight seems to mean one terrible thing, on reflection turns out to mean one tremendous thing. On the surface, the betrayal of Joseph, like the death of Jesus, looks awful. It looks horrendous. It looks horrific. But in fact, when all things are considered, it means something else, something better, something totally unexpected, something glorious. Back to Emmaus, you can imagine the disciples doing a double take when this strange fellow traveler turns out to be so very well informed about the Hebrew Scriptures and about how they relate to Jesus and all that's recently happened in Jerusalem. And they listen, and they listen, and they still don't get it. Just how stupid can they get? But the touching thing is that they take a liking to him and they press him to spend the night in their house. And then the punchline, so to speak, comes over supper when they finally cotton on, when Jesus breaks the bread. Then they recognize him. I like to imagine that they were sipping wine at the time and they snorted all over the table. And then, as soon as they see who he is, he vanishes. How annoying. And then they have to race back to their friends in Jerusalem without any direct evidence of what has just happened to them. And on the way, they try to justify their slow-wittedness by telling each other how they had suspected something all along. I got this strange burning feeling in my heart. Oh, so did I, yes. What they had understood in one way about Joseph and Jonah and Job and Jacob and David and Samson, stories they had been familiar with all their lives, no doubt. What they had understood in one way, they now have to understand in a whole new way. Everything now makes a different kind of sense when seen through the lens of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ provides the true perspective, the true focus into the Hebrew Scriptures. Christ's life and death and resurrection is the new context, the new paradigm for understanding not only the recent history of what's been going on in Jerusalem, but what had always been going on in the history of Israel. The disciples now see afresh. They get an X-ray into the real meaning of their own past. Now, I've spent a good deal of my career as a scholar studying the works of C.S. Lewis. And Lewis is fascinated with this question of how we view things, of getting the right interpretive lens, seeing things from the right perspective. Let me give you, I think I've got time for 3 quick examples. One comes from his dream vision, The Great Divorce, where we learn that heaven works backwards. Lewis, if you've read The Great Divorce, you'll remember, he puts himself in a dream among a group of people in hell who, according to the dream, take a day trip to heaven. And once he arrives on the outskirts of heaven, he's welcomed by a guide who tells him that goodness, the goodness of heaven, when it's fully grown, becomes retrospective. That is what mortals misunderstand, says the guide. They say of some temporal suffering, no future bliss can make up for it, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into a glory. The guide goes on, explaining that it's a process that begins, or may begin, even before death. The good man's past begins to change so that his forgiven sins and his remembered sorrows take on the quality of heaven. And that is why, at the end of all things, when the sun rises here in heaven, the blessed will say, "We have never lived anywhere except in heaven." And they will speak truly. That is the real sense of what they will say. What happens to the saved is best described as the opposite of a mirage. What seemed, when they entered it, to be the veil of misery, turns out, when they look back, to have been a well, and where present experience saw only salt deserts, memory truthfully records that the pools were full of water. You will spot the allusions to Psalm 84 there. The Christian doctrine of hope holds out the prospect not of simply extracting us from the pains of this world, as if this world and our passage through it were essentially worthless, something to be got over as quickly as possible. Rather, it holds out the hope of reinterpreting this world, setting it in a new context. Nothing is yet in its final state. Once the final state in heaven does actually arrive, we will be able to look back and see the whole reality of our lives, the true meaning of all that we've been through. And this revolution in meaning is perhaps the most glorious thing about the doctrine of hope. Christian hope doesn't change the facts, it changes the interpretation of the facts. In this world, we are bound to suffer and eventually to die. We cannot change those facts. But what meaning will our suffering and death ultimately have? Will the meaning be fixed and unalterable as a dark and grim thing, as we so often currently perceive our sufferings and other people's deaths to be? A great deal of our suffering comes not just from the painful things themselves, but from the belief that things are now set. That's what our life's meaning has become. Our parents have divorced. We have been jilted by our significant other. We have fallen ill. We've become disabled. Whatever it is, we've fallen short in this way or that. And we feel that things are now fixed. We are that person and there's nothing more to say. Well, Christ's cross shows us that a cross, though it may not be escapable, is certainly reinterpretable. Our sufferings can be radically reinterpreted. God can change the past, not by changing the facts, but by changing the interpretation of the facts. Nothing is quite fixed. If the horrific Friday of Christ's crucifixion and death can somehow become Good Friday, as all Christians refer to it, can't our sufferings also somehow, mysteriously, eventually also become good sufferings? Hard to see how, but the Christian hope holds out the prospect that this will indeed be the case. So that's my first example from C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce. Secondly, in my study of the Chronicles of Narnia, I have made, I believe, a genuine literary discovery about the meaning of those books, and that's what I'll be talking about this afternoon at 4:15 and tomorrow night at UTC. This is the second example of Lewis's interest in seeing with the right kind of lens, because many scholars have interpreted the Narnia books as a bit of a hodgepodge, a bit of a mishmash. Tolkien, Lewis's great friend, J.R.R.R. Tolkien, he himself couldn't abide the way Lewis assembled the Narnia tales out of what he, Tolkien, regarded as incompatible mythological traditions, just thrown in together any old how. And on the surface, Tolkien's criticism of Narnia has got something going for it. But what I've discovered in the course of my own research is that Lewis's paradigm, his own imaginative blueprint, was something quite other than a hodgepodge. It was a design based on the symbolism of the seven heavens. And seen from that perspective, the Narnia Chronicles reveal themselves to be intricate, complex works of sophisticated artistry, polished to the final degree. They are not a mishmash at all, properly understood. And just as with the Chronicles, so we may hope with our own lives, which themselves so often seem haphazard and messy, pointless. All things may work together for good for those who love God. Our lives, we may hope, will themselves turn out to have been authored by a divine writer who knows what he's doing with his own impeccable imaginative logic, even though it may be very hard for us to see at times. And the third example from Lewis is taken from one of those Narnia Chronicles, The Horse and His Boy, where you may recall Shasta, the young hero who goes through all sorts of trials and tribulations, comes to a very lonely point in his journey atop a mountain pass. He's alone, he's cold, it's dark, it's foggy. And then we read this passage. "I do think," said Shasta, "that I must be the most unfortunate boy in the whole world. Everything goes right for everyone except me." And being very tired and having nothing inside him, he felt so sorry for himself that the tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to all this was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone or somebody was walking beside him. It was pitch dark and he could see nothing, and the thing or person who was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale, and Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature, and he had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he had really no idea how long it had been there. It was a horrible shock. It darted into his mind that he had heard long ago that there were giants in these northern countries. He bit his lip in terror. But now that he really had something to cry about, he stopped crying. At last he could bear it no longer. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. Are you a giant?" asked Shasta. "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I am not like the creatures you call giants." "I can't see you at all," said Shasta, after staring very hard. Then, for an even more terrible idea had come into his head, he said, almost in a scream, You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please go away. What harm have I ever done you? I am the unluckiest person in the whole world." He felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and face. "There," it said, "that is not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows." Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, so he told how he had never known his real father or mother and had been brought up sternly by his stepfather, the fisherman, And then he told of his escape and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and of all the dangers, and about his night among the tombs, and how the beasts howled at him out of the desert. And he told about the heat and thirst of their desert journey, and how they were almost at their goal when another lion chased them, and also how very long it was since he had anything to eat. "I do not call you unfortunate," said the large voice. "Don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?" said Shasta. "There was only one lion," said the voice. "What on earth do you mean? I've just told you there were at least 2 the first night, and there was only one, but he was swift of foot." "How do you know?" "I was the lion." And as Shasta gaped with open mouth and said nothing, the voice continued, "I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile, so you should reach the king in time. And I was the lion you do not remember, who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to shore, where a fisherman sat, wakeful at midnight, to receive you." That is a beautiful passage, one of the most moving in the whole of the Narnia Chronicles, if you ask me. And in that passage, Shasta discovers that his whole life, which has seemed so unfortunate, has been providentially guided. And that from Aslan's point of view, all his misfortunes look very different. Now, that does not mean that Shasta was wrong to hate the cruelty of his cruel stepfather. It does not mean that he was wrong to feel lonely and sad during his overnight vigil at the tombs. Our emotional responses to the various situations we find ourselves in are part of the total drama of our lives, and they are valid. But they are part of our lives that God, in his mercy, uses to bring about his purposes. Jesus himself wept at the death of Lazarus. And if we are to treat the dimension of time seriously, we should not be afraid to weep and mourn at our sorrows. However, we needn't assume that time is the only dimension in which our lives can be lived. There is also the eternal perspective, God's perspective, the heavenly perspective, and our prospect of ultimately attaining that larger dimension, in which the backward mutters of dissevering power will be heard, to quote the poet John Milton. The backward mutters of dissevering power. John Milton, author of Paradise Lost, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes this morning, the author of Paradise Regained. Backward mutters of dissevering power. What a phrase. God's backing vocals. Let's listen for them.